The stallion stood alone on the auction block, wild eyes rolling with terror as the crowd murmured their disapproval. His coat was matted with burrs and mud, ribs pressing against scarred hide, hooves cracked from months of surviving in terrain that broke weaker animals. The auctioneer's voice cracked with frustration as bid after bid fell silent. This wasn't the polished stock that buyers traveled hundreds of miles to see. This was something feral, dangerous, unfit for civilized work. When the gavel finally dropped without a single offer, the stallion was led away toward a fate that everyone understood but nobody spoke aloud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He had been deemed worthless by every measure that mattered in this world. But in the shadows of that arena, one man saw something different. A cowboy with calloused hands and eyes that knew what it meant to be cast aside watched the animal disappear through the back gates. And in that moment, a decision formed that would alter two lives forever. What followed was not just a rescue. It was a reckoning. The autumn wind carried a bitter edge across the Montana high plains, sweeping through the valleys and over the ridges where the grass had turned gold and brittle. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by clusters of pine and the jagged rise of distant mountains. It was country that demanded respect, where the winters came hard and the summers burned hot, and only those willing to bend with its moods could survive. On the northern edge of Ridgefield County sat Crown Ranch, a sprawling testament to wealth and ambition. White fences lined the property for miles, enclosing pastures where champion quarter horses grazed on imported hay. The main house rose like a monument, all stone and timber, with windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Victor Hartwell had built his empire on breeding winners, animals with bloodlines that traced back generations, horses that commanded six-figure prices at auction. His operation was ruthless in its efficiency. Every foal was evaluated within hours of birth, measured against standards that left no room for sentiment. Conformation, temperament, movement, potential, all assessed with cold precision. Those that passed became part of the Crown Ranch legacy. Those that failed were removed before they could tarnish the reputation Hartwell had spent decades building. On a cold September morning, the ranch hands gathered in the main stable as a mare labored through a difficult birth. She was a proven producer, her previous offspring winning ribbons across 3 states, and expectations ran high. But when the foal finally emerged into the world, silence fell across the stable. The colt was small, his legs too long for his underdeveloped body, his breathing shallow and strained. Worse, his coat bore the markings of his wild Mustang grandfather, a bloodline Hartwell had tried to breed out for years. The splash of white across his face and the primitive stripes on his legs marked him as a throwback, a genetic reminder of stock Hartwell considered inferior. Victor Hartwell stood in the doorway of the stall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was a tall man with silver hair and a bearing that commanded immediate deference. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. "Get it out of here." The words dropped like stones into water, creating ripples of discomfort among the younger hands. Danny Cole, barely 24 and new to the ranch, looked up from where he knelt beside the struggling colt. "Sir, he might just need some time. Weak foals sometimes come around if we give them a chance." Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "Time is money, and I don't invest either in mistakes. That colt will never meet Crown Ranch standards. He's got Mustang written all over him, and I won't have wild blood contaminating my breeding program. Take him out past the canyon and turn him loose. Nature will handle the rest." The other hands shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. They had seen this before, though never stated so bluntly. Hartwell ran his operation like a business, and in business there was no room for charity cases. Danny swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had grown up on a small farm where every animal mattered, where his family nursed sick calves through the night and celebrated when the runt of a litter survived. This felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, but he was the newest hire, and jobs were scarce in this part of Montana. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. The mare, exhausted from the birth, called weakly to her foal as Danny fashioned a rope halter around the colt's head. The little stallion tried to stand, legs trembling violently, but collapsed back into the straw. Danny's hands shook as he lifted the animal, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his chest. The weight was almost nothing, like carrying an oversized dog, and the fragility of it made his stomach turn. He carried the colt out through the back of the stable, away from the main buildings where Hartwell wouldn't have to see the mess of his decision. The other hands had already returned to their work. The incident filed away as just another day at Crown Ranch. Danny loaded the colt into the bed of an old pickup truck, lining it with a tarp to keep the animal from sliding. The drive out to the Badlands took nearly an hour, following dirt roads that deteriorated into barely visible tracks. The landscape changed as he drove, the manicured pastures of Crown Ranch giving way to wild country where rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth and scraggly juniper clung to hillsides. This was the land that bordered the ranch on its eastern edge, technically still Hartwell property but too rough for cattle or horses. It was perfect for making things disappear. When Danny finally stopped the truck, the sun had climbed higher, though its warmth did little to cut the wind. He sat for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince himself this was just part of ranch life. Animals died. Weak stock got culled. This was no different, except it was. He climbed out and lowered the tailgate, looking down at the colt who had somehow managed to lift its head. Those dark eyes stared at him with an expression Danny would remember for the rest of his life. Not accusation exactly, but a simple awareness that cut deeper than anger ever could. "I'm sorry," Danny whispered, though the words felt hollow. He reached down and gently lifted the colt, carrying it away from the truck toward a cluster of rocks that offered minimal shelter. The animal's breathing had grown more labored, each inhale a visible effort. Danny set him down as carefully as possible, then stepped back. The colt tried once more to stand, front legs pushing against the ground, but the strength wasn't there. He collapsed with a soft sound that might have been a cry or simply exhaustion. Danny forced himself to turn away, climbing back into the truck. He didn't look in the rearview mirror as he drove off, couldn't bear to see the small figure growing smaller in the distance. The dust from his tires hung in the air long after he had gone, settling slowly over the rocks and sparse vegetation. By the time he returned to Crown Ranch, Danny had constructed a story in his mind, one where the colt had simply been too weak to survive the trip, where nature had taken its course quickly and without suffering. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that let him sleep at night. Back at the ranch, life continued without pause. Hartwell never asked about the colt, and the other hands knew better than to bring it up. The mare was given medication to dry up her milk and would be bred again in the spring. By evening, it was as if the morning's events had never happened. But out in the Badlands, as the sun began its descent and shadows stretched long across the canyon, the colt remained. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps now, his body shivering despite the heat still radiating from the rocks. Flies had found him, drawn by the scent of birth and weakness. He made small sounds, calling for a mother who would never answer, instinct driving him to seek comfort even as his strength ebbed away. The first night fell with brutal cold. The temperature dropped 30 degrees once the sun disappeared, and frost formed on the rocks around where the colt lay. He had managed to pull himself into a slight depression between two boulders, some primal part of his brain seeking shelter, but it offered little protection from the wind that howled through the canyon. By dawn, he was still breathing, though barely. His eyes had glazed over. The bright awareness from the day before faded to something distant and dull. The sun rose and baked the rocks again, and still he clung to life with a stubbornness that defied logic. Coyotes passed nearby that afternoon, 3 of them moving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In their skulking way across the canyon floor, they caught his scent and approached cautiously, circling, testing. The colt didn't move, lacked the strength even to lift his head. But something in the air shifted, perhaps the distant sound of a vehicle or simply the random chance that governs all wild things, and the coyotes moved on. 2 more days passed in this liminal space between life and death. The colt's body began to show the effects of exposure and starvation. His ribs stood out in sharp relief, his breathing grew more irregular, and his attempts to move became feeble twitches. Twice more he tried to stand, driven by some deep instinct that refused to accept defeat, and twice more his legs buckled beneath him. On the 3rd morning, when the sun rose over the eastern peaks and spilled its light across the Badlands, the colt lay absolutely still. A raven circled overhead, patient and certain. The story should have ended there, in that desolate place where the rejected came to die. But the universe, indifferent to human judgments of worth, had other plans. Tom Brennan had learned long ago that the land didn't care about a man's plans. He had ridden out that morning with the intention of checking the fence line along his eastern boundary, where the wire had a habit of sagging under the weight of tumbleweeds. His property bordered the wild country that stretched toward the mountains, 20 acres of stubborn earth that he had purchased 15 years ago with money saved from 2 decades of ranch work. It wasn't much compared to the operations that dominated the valley, but it was his, paid for with sweat and the kind of patience that only came from understanding that some things couldn't be rushed. The day had started clear, the kind of autumn morning where the air tasted sharp and clean, but by noon clouds had begun gathering over the peaks. Tom knew the signs well enough. A storm was coming, probably snow given the temperature, and he wanted to finish his work before it arrived. He rode an old bay gelding named Copper, a horse that had seen better years but remained steady and reliable. They moved at an easy pace across the scrubland, Tom's eyes scanning the fence posts and wire out of habit more than concern. It was Copper who noticed first. The gelding's ears swiveled forward, his gait stuttering as he turned his head toward a cluster of rocks about 100 yards off the trail. Tom felt the change in the horse's body immediately, that sudden tension that signaled something unexpected. He pulled gently on the reins, bringing Copper to a halt, and followed the animal's gaze toward the formation of boulders that jutted from the earth like the spine of some buried giant. At first Tom saw nothing unusual. The Badlands were full of shadows and shapes that played tricks on the eyes, and he had learned not to jump at every movement of sagebrush or tumbling rock. But Copper remained fixated, nostrils flaring as he tested the air, and Tom trusted the horse's instincts more than his own aging eyes. He dismounted slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and tied Copper's reins to a weathered juniper. The gelding stamped nervously but held his ground as Tom approached the rocks on foot. The smell hit him before he saw anything, the sharp metallic scent of blood mixed with something else, the distinctive odor of an animal in distress. Tom's hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, but he left it there. Whatever was ahead wasn't large enough to pose a threat, and something about the stillness suggested he wouldn't need a weapon. He moved carefully around the largest boulder, boots crunching on loose gravel, and stopped short at what he found. The colt lay wedged between 2 rocks, its body so still that for a moment Tom thought he was looking at a corpse. The animal's coat was matted with dirt and dried blood, ribs standing out in stark relief beneath hide that had lost all luster. Flies clustered around its eyes and muzzle, and its breathing was so shallow that Tom had to watch for several seconds before he detected any movement at all. The colt's legs were folded awkwardly beneath it, and from the angle of its body, Tom guessed it hadn't moved in at least a day, maybe longer. Tom knelt slowly, his shadow falling across the animal's face. The colt's eyes remained closed, the lids sunken and dark. Up close, Tom could see the distinctive markings that marked the animal as part Mustang, the primitive stripes on the legs and the broad blaze across the face that spoke of wild ancestry. He had seen enough ranch operations to recognize what this meant. Someone had deemed this colt unworthy and disposed of it in the way that powerful men often disposed of things they considered mistakes. Something twisted in Tom's chest, an old anger that he had thought long buried. He had spent his youth working for men like that, ranchers who measured everything in dollars and winning records, who could look at a living creature and see only profit or loss. He had watched good animals destroyed because they didn't meet arbitrary standards, had seen the callousness that came from treating life as a commodity. It was part of why he had eventually saved enough to buy his own place, small as it was. Out here on his 20 acres, he didn't have to answer to anyone's definition of worth. Tom reached out carefully, placing his hand against the colt's neck. The skin was hot to the touch, fever burning through what little reserves the animal had left. The pulse beneath Tom's fingers was rapid and thready, the heartbeat of something clinging to existence by the thinnest margin. He sat back on his heels, studying the colt with eyes that had seen too much death to harbor many illusions. This animal was dying. Even with immediate care, the odds were stacked impossibly high against survival. The sensible thing would be to end its suffering quickly, a single bullet to spare it days of slow starvation. That was the practical choice, the one that made sense in a land where sentiment was a luxury most couldn't afford. Tom looked up at the sky where the clouds continued to gather, dark and heavy with the promise of snow. He thought about his cabin, empty except for the ghosts of better times, and the long winter ahead where his only company would be copper and the silence. He thought about his son, dead 3 years now in a highway accident that had turned Tom's world into something gray and distant. He thought about all the times he had told himself that caring too much was a weakness, that attachment led only to loss, and how that philosophy had left him with nothing but the hollow ache of isolation. The colt made a sound then, barely more than a whisper of air, but it broke through Tom's calculations like a stone through glass. He looked down at the animal's face, at the way the flies crawled across its closed eyes, and made a decision that had nothing to do with sense or practicality. He stood slowly, his back protesting, and walked back to where Copper waited. The gelding watched him with large, patient eyes as Tom untied the rope from his saddle and fashioned it into a makeshift sling. He pulled his jacket off and laid it across Coppa's back, then returned to the colt. Getting the animal onto the horse proved harder than Tom had anticipated. The colt was dead weight, unable to help in any way, and Tom's strength wasn't what it had been. He had to rest twice, breathing hard, before he finally managed to drape the limp body across Coppa's back. The gelding shifted nervously at the strange burden, but Tom spoke to him in low, steady tones, and the horse settled. Tom secured the colt with the rope, making sure the animal wouldn't slide off, then took Coppa's reins and began the long walk back toward his property. The journey took over an hour, Tom leading the horse slowly across the rough terrain, while keeping one hand on the colt to steady it. The wind picked up as they walked, carrying the first flakes of snow that melted instantly on Tom's bare arms. He had left his jacket with the colt, and the cold bit through his flannel shirt, but he barely noticed. His attention was focused entirely on the animal draped across his horse, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that it was still breathing. Several times he stopped to check, pressing his hand against the colt's chest until he felt the faint flutter of life continuing its stubborn resistance against the inevitable. By the time Tom's cabin came into view, the snow was falling steadily, large flakes that stuck to the ground and began accumulating in the sheltered spots. Tom led Copper directly to the small barn that sat behind the cabin, a structure he had built himself from salvaged lumber and determination. Inside, out of the wind, the air felt almost warm by comparison. Tom's hands shook as he untied the rope and carefully slid the colt down from Coppa's back. He carried the animal to an empty stall that he quickly lined with every blanket he could find, creating a nest of fabric that he hoped would help the colt retain what little body heat it had left. The colt's eyes remained closed as Tom laid him down, but a faint tremor ran through the small body, and Tom chose to interpret it as a good sign. He rubbed Copper down quickly, more out of habit than necessity, then left the horse munching hay in his own stall while he jogged through the increasing snow to the cabin. Inside, he grabbed every towel and spare blanket, his first aid kit, and the bottles of electrolyte solution he kept for sick animals. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies, though part of his mind whispered that he was wasting his time, that the colt would be dead by morning regardless of what he did. Back in the barn, Tom set to work. He filled a bucket with lukewarm water and began gently cleaning the dirt and dried blood from the colt's coat. The animal didn't react to the touch, too far gone to register the sensation, and Tom worked carefully around the closed eyes and crusted muzzle. As he cleaned, he discovered more about the colt's condition. There were no obvious injuries, no broken bones or deep wounds, just the slow deterioration that came from exposure and starvation. That was both good and bad. Good because it meant there was nothing catastrophic to address. Bad because it meant the damage was systemic, written into every cell of the animal's body. Tom mixed electrolytes with water and tried to get some liquid into the colt. It was slow, frustrating work. The animal's swallowing reflex was barely present, and most of what Tom managed to get past its lips simply dribbled back out. But he persisted, talking softly as he worked. His voice filling the silence of the barn with a steady stream of words that were as much for his own benefit as the colt's. He talked about the weather, about Copper, about the fence he had been planning to fix. He talked about his son, something he rarely did anymore, remembering aloud the way the boy had loved animals, how he had begged for a horse of his own and had been so proud when Tom finally brought one home. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the storm settled in with serious intent, the wind howling around the barn and driving snow through every crack and gap. Tom hung a lantern from a hook and watched as shadows danced across the walls. He sat with his back against the stall partition, one hand resting on the colt's shoulder, feeling the shallow rise and fall of breath that continued despite all logic. Copper dozed in the neighboring stall, occasionally stamping or blowing softly through his nose, and the familiar sounds created a kind of comfort in the darkness. Tom must have dozed himself, because he jerked awake to find the lantern burning low and the barn darker than before. His first thought was for the colt, and his hand moved immediately to check for breathing. The animal was still alive, the pulse perhaps slightly stronger than before, though that might have been wishful thinking. Tom struggled to his feet, joints stiff from sitting too long on the cold ground, and refilled the lantern from the can of oil. He kept in the tack room. He checked on Copper, gave him fresh water, then returned to the stall where the colt lay. Something had changed. Took Tom a moment to identify what, but then he saw it. The colt's eyes were open, just barely, two thin crescents of darkness visible beneath the lids. Tom knelt quickly, moving into the animal's line of sight, and those eyes tracked toward him with a focus that hadn't been there before. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but in that moment it felt like a miracle. The colt was aware, connected to the world again rather than drifting in whatever gray space lies between life and death. Tom felt his throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He reached for the water bottle again and tried once more to get liquid into the colt. This time, when the water touched the animal's lips, there was a response. The tongue moved weakly, and a swallow followed, then another. It was clumsy and incomplete, half the water still spilling out, but it was progress. Tom found himself grinning like an idiot in the dim light of the barn, encouraging the colt with words that tumbled over each other. That's it. Come on now. You can do this. Just a little more. Good. That's good. He spent the next hour working to get as much fluid into the colt as the animal could handle, which wasn't much. Between attempts, Tom wrapped the small body more securely in blankets, creating layers of warmth. He found himself touching the colt constantly, his hands checking temperature, feeling for changes in breathing, simply maintaining contact. It was behavior he recognized from his years of raising livestock, the instinct to stay close to sick animals, as if human presence alone could tip the scales toward survival. Dawn came gray and muted, the barn slowly filling with pale light that filtered through the snow still falling outside. Tom had been awake all night, and exhaustion pulled at him, but he forced himself to keep moving. He heated water on the small propane burner he kept in the tack room and mixed it with molasses and a pinch of salt, creating a solution that would provide some calories along with the hydration. The colt was more responsive now, eyes fully open and tracking Tom's movements. When Tom offered the mixture, the animal's tongue reached for it with something approaching eagerness, though the effort clearly exhausted him. Tom sat back, watching the colt with an expression that mixed hope and worry in equal measure. The animal had made it through the night, which was more than he had dared expect, but the road ahead remained impossibly steep. It would take weeks of intensive care just to stabilize him, and even then there were no guarantees. Pneumonia, organ failure, Any number of complications could still claim a life this fragile. The sensible part of Tom's brain whispered that he was setting himself up for heartbreak, that he should prepare for failure rather than success. But another part, the part that had carried a dying colt through a snowstorm rather than leave it to die alone, wasn't interested in being sensible. Tom reached out and placed his hand on the white blaze that ran down the colt's face, feeling the heat of fever still burning beneath the skin. The animal's eyes closed at the touch, not from weakness now but from something else, acceptance maybe, or trust. Tom found himself speaking again, his voice rough from exhaustion and emotion. "You're going to need a name. Can't just keep calling you the colt." He paused, thinking, his mind turning over possibilities and discarding them. Then it came to him, simple and fitting. "Blaze. Because of this mark here, and because you've got fire in you. Kept you alive when you should have died. That's worth something." The colt, Blaze, made no sound in response, but his breathing seemed to settle into a more regular rhythm, and Tom chose to take that as approval. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body protesting, and looked down at the small bundle of blankets and determination that now occupied his barn. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping, and Tom knew he would be snowed in for at least a day, maybe more. But that was fine. He had nowhere else to be, nothing else that mattered more than the life struggling to establish itself in the nest of blankets before him. Tom made his way to the cabin, moving through snow that already reached his ankles. Inside, he started a fire in the wood stove and put coffee on to brew. He stood at the window, looking out at the white world beyond, and allowed himself a moment of honest reflection. He had no idea what he was doing. No idea if Blaze would survive another day, let alone recover enough to have any quality of life. No idea why he had committed himself to this impossible task. But as he sipped his coffee and felt the warmth of the fire begin to fill the small room, Tom realized that for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. He felt needed. He felt purpose. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth all the uncertainty ahead. Victor Hartwell stood in his office, a room paneled in dark wood with windows that overlooked the manicured grounds of Crown Ranch. He held a crystal tumbler of whiskey, though it was barely past noon, and stared at the collection of ribbons and trophies that lined the shelves. Each one represented a victory, proof that his methods worked, that his approach to breeding produced results that lesser operations could only envy. He had built this empire through discipline and the willingness to make hard choices, cutting away anything that threatened the purity of his vision. Danny Cole's voice came to him from the hallway, responding to something another hand had said, and Hartwell felt a flicker of irritation. The boy was too soft, too prone to sentiment. Hartwell had seen it in his eyes when he gave the order about the colt, that flicker of rebellion that spoke of someone who hadn't yet learned that mercy was expensive and weakness was contagious. He would need to keep an eye on Danny, make sure the boy understood that at Crown Ranch, there was only one way of doing things. Hartwell took a long drink from his glass, feeling the burn of expensive liquor slide down his throat. The colt was gone, disposed of properly, and life moved forward as it always did. There was no room for regret in his world, no space for wondering about roads not taken. He had learned that lesson decades ago, and it had served him well. Some things were simply meant to be discarded, and only a fool wasted time mourning mistakes. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the high plains, covering the land in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But beneath that pristine surface, life continued in all its messy complexity. In a small barn 20 miles away, a cowboy sat beside a dying colt and refused to let go. And in the cold mathematics of survival, sometimes refusal was the only miracle that mattered. The storm lasted 3 days, burying the high plains under 2 feet of heavy snow that transformed the landscape into something alien and pristine. Tom spent those days moving between the cabin and the barn, carving a path through the drifts that grew deeper with each trip. The world contracted to just those 2 structures and the space between them, everything beyond reduced to white silence and howling wind. Inside the barn, Blaze fought his own battle. The first 48 hours were the worst, a precarious balancing act where every small victory was shadowed by potential catastrophe. Tom learned to read the subtle signs of the colt's condition. The way his breathing changed when fever spiked, the slight shifts in posture that indicated growing strength or sudden weakness. Sleep became something Tom stole in brief increments, dozing in the stall with his back against the wall, one hand always resting on Blaze so he would wake if the animal's condition deteriorated. On the second morning, Tom woke to find Blaze attempting to lift his head, the first sustained movement the colt had managed since being brought to the barn. The effort clearly cost him everything, muscles trembling with exertion, but he held the position for nearly 10 seconds before collapsing back into the blankets. Tom felt something break loose in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. He moved closer, running his hand along Blaze's neck, feeling the heat of fever that had finally begun to break during the night. "You stubborn fool," Tom murmured, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother to hide. "Nobody told you it was okay to start fighting back." The colt's ear swiveled toward his voice, a small gesture that felt monumental in its significance. Tom mixed another batch of electrolyte solution, this time adding a small amount of milk replacer he had found in the back of his supply cabinet, left over from a calf he had raised 2 years ago. Blaze took the mixture eagerly, his swallowing reflex stronger now, though he still tired quickly and could only manage a few ounces before exhaustion forced him to rest. Tom established a routine during those snowbound days, structured around Blaze's needs but also around his own requirement for some semblance of normalcy. Every 2 hours he offered fluids, gradually increasing the amount as Blaze's stomach adjusted. Between feedings, he cleaned the stall, changed the blankets, and monitored the colt's vital signs with the obsessive attention of someone who understood how quickly things could still go wrong. He talked constantly, filling the barn with a stream of words that ranged from mundane observations about the weather to deeper confessions about his son, his failed marriage, the years of drifting that had brought him to this isolated patch of Montana. Blaze listened with what Tom chose to interpret as understanding, those dark eyes tracking every movement, ears responding to the cadence of speech, even when the words themselves meant nothing. Tom found himself drawing comfort from the one-sided conversations, discovering that speaking aloud about things he had kept locked inside for years somehow lessened their weight. He told Blaze about the accident that had taken his son, how the call had come on a Tuesday afternoon while Tom was mending fence, how the world had simply stopped making sense in the moment between hearing the news and accepting it as real. The colt made no judgment, offered no platitudes or useless comfort, simply existed as a living presence that absorbed the words and gave Tom permission to speak them. In return, Tom poured every ounce of skill and determination he possessed into keeping that presence alive. He heated stones on the propane burner and wrapped them in towels, placing them around Blaze's body to help maintain core temperature. He massaged the colt's legs to keep circulation flowing, working each joint carefully to prevent stiffness from setting in. When Blaze's breathing grew congested, Tom fashioned a steam tent using a tarp and a pot of boiling water infused with eucalyptus oil, sitting with the colt in the humid warmth while the vapor slowly cleared his passages. By the third day, as the storm finally began to break, Blaze made his first serious attempt to stand. Tom was cleaning the water bucket when he heard the sound of hooves scraping against the stall floor, a scrambling noise that sent him spinning around in time to see Blaze lurch upward on shaking legs. The colt made it halfway vertical before his strength gave out, collapsing sideways into the blankets with a frustrated snort that sounded almost indignant. Tom rushed to his side, checking quickly for injury, but Blaze had simply exhausted himself with the effort. The colt lay panting, sides heaving, but his eyes burned with a determination that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted during the storm, some internal decision made in whatever space served as consciousness for a young horse. Blaze had chosen to live, not just to survive but to actively fight for existence, and that choice blazed from him now with an intensity that left Tom shaken. "Easy now," Tom said, his hands gentle as he repositioned the blankets. "We'll get you up when you're ready. No rush." But even as he spoke the words, he felt a smile pulling at his face, the first genuine expression of joy he had experienced in longer than he could remember. The attempt, failed as it was, represented a milestone that transformed everything. Blaze wasn't just clinging to life anymore. He was reaching for it, The days that followed the storm established a new rhythm. The snow began to melt under bright sun, turning Tom's property into a maze of mud and standing water. But inside the barn, progress continued in small, steady increments. Blaze's appetite improved, allowing Tom to introduce soft feeds mixed with the milk replacer. The colt attacked each meal with enthusiasm that sometimes outpaced his capacity, forcing Tom to ration portions to prevent digestive upset. Weight began to return slowly, softening the sharp angles of ribs and hip bones, filling out the hollows that had made Blaze look more skeleton than horse. Standing became a daily goal, each attempt lasting a few seconds longer than the last. Tom fashioned a sling from old canvas and rope, suspending it from the barn rafters so he could help support Blaze's weight during these efforts. The colt would struggle upward, legs splaying awkwardly, while Tom held the sling and murmured encouragement. At first, 10 seconds was a victory, then 20. Then a full minute of trembling endurance before Blaze's legs would buckle and Tom would ease him back down to the blankets. Copper watched these proceedings from his stall with the patient disinterest of an old horse who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. But sometimes, when Blaze managed a particularly good session, Copper would nicker softly, a sound of approval that Tom chose to believe was the gelding's way of offering encouragement to the youngster who had invaded his barn. 2 weeks after the rescue, Tom woke before dawn to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. He lay in his bunk, the cabin dark around him, trying to place the noise that had pulled him from sleep. Then it came again, clearer now, the distinct whinny of a young horse calling out with surprising strength. Tom was out of bed and pulling on his boots before his mind fully processed what he had heard. He grabbed a flashlight and stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness to the barn, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear about what he might find. Inside, Blaze was standing, not propped in the sling, not held up by Tom's supporting hands, but standing on his own 4 legs in the center of the stall. The colt swayed slightly, muscles quivering with effort, but he held the position as Tom approached. When the flashlight beam found him, Blaze turned his head toward the light, and even in the dimness Tom could see the change that had occurred. The glazed, distant look was gone completely, replaced by an alertness that spoke of a mind fully engaged with the world around it. Tom felt his throat close up, emotion ambushing him with an intensity that left him gripping the stall door for support. He had seen miracles in his 63 years, had witnessed births and survivals that defied explanation, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that transcended the simple relationship between man and animal. He had poured himself into saving this colt, had given pieces of himself he thought had died with his son, and now here stood living proof that such giving could still matter. "Well, look at you," Tom managed finally, his voice rough, "standing there like you own the place." Blaze took a tentative step forward, legs stiff and uncoordinated, but the movement was deliberate and controlled. He made it 3 paces before his strength failed and he folded back down into the blankets. But those 3 paces might as well have been miles for the pride they kindled in Tom's chest. He entered the stall and knelt beside the colt, running his hands over the legs that had carried Blaze upright, checking for heat or swelling that might indicate strain. Everything felt solid, the joints moving properly, the muscles responding as they should. Tom allowed himself a moment of pure relief, pressing his forehead against Blaze's shoulder while the colt stood patiently beneath the touch. They remained that way as dawn broke outside, light slowly filling the barn with a golden glow that turned the dust motes into dancing stars. When Tom finally pulled away, he found Blaze watching him with an expression that seemed almost knowing, as if the colt understood exactly what his survival meant to the man who had refused to let him die. The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. Tom called the veterinarian in Ridgefield, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wells who had treated Copper for colic the previous year. She arrived that afternoon, driving a truck that had seen better decades, and spent an hour examining Blaze with thorough professionalism. Tom hovered nearby, unable to help himself, answering questions about the colt's history and the treatment he had provided. Dr. Wells worked in silence, her weathered hands moving with practiced confidence, as she listened to heart and lungs, palpated the abdomen, checked reflexes and responses. When she finally stepped back, Her expression was difficult to read. "Tom," she said slowly, "this horse shouldn't be alive. Everything you've told me about his condition when you found him, the exposure, the starvation, by all rights he should have died in that canyon." Tom crossed his arms, defensive without meaning to be. "But he didn't." Dr. Wells smiled, a quick flash that softened her angular features. "No, he didn't. And that's down to you and whatever fire keeps burning in that little body." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But you need to understand, he's not out of danger yet. The next few weeks are critical. His system has been through tremendous trauma, and complications can still arise. Pneumonia is a real risk, as is colic if we increase his feed too quickly. His bones and joints are still developing, and malnutrition can cause permanent damage that might not show up until he's older." Tom nodded, absorbing the information even as part of him wanted to reject it. He had already invested so much, come so far, that the thought of losing Blaze now felt impossible to contemplate. "What do I need to do?" Dr. Wells pulled a notebook from her pocket and began writing. "I'm going to give you a feeding schedule, specific amounts, and types of nutrition. We need to rebuild his body slowly, giving his system time to adapt. Keep him warm, keep him moving as much as he can tolerate without overexertion. Watch for any signs of respiratory distress, lethargy, loss of appetite. If anything changes, you call me immediately, day or night." She tore the page from the notebook and handed it to Tom, then reached into her truck and pulled out several bottles of supplements and medications. "This is vitamin E and selenium, important for muscle development. This one is a probiotic to help his gut flora recover. And this is an antibiotic, just as a precaution given his compromised immune system." Tom took the bottles, feeling the weight of them as a physical reminder of how much still needed to be done. He glanced back at the barn where Blaze waited, then met Dr. Wells' eyes. "He's going to make it." It wasn't a question. Dr. Wells studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "If determination counts for anything, then yes, he probably is." She climbed into her truck, then paused with her hand on the door. "Tom, whatever happened to this colt before you found him, someone made a choice to throw him away. You might want to think about what you'll do if that someone comes looking to reclaim him." Tom's jaw tightened. "Nobody's taking him." Dr. Wells held his gaze, then nodded again. "Good. Because that little fighter in there deserves better than being someone's discarded mistake." She drove away, truck rattling down the muddy drive, leaving Tom standing in the afternoon sun with his arms full of medical supplies and his mind churning with new worries. The thought of someone trying to claim Blaze hadn't occurred to him, seemed so fundamentally wrong that he had trouble even processing it as a possibility. But Dr. Wells was right to raise the concern. In his years working ranches, Tom had seen enough property disputes and ownership battles to know that the law didn't always align with justice or common sense. He carried the supplies into the barn, pushing the worry aside for later contemplation. Blaze greeted him with a soft nicker, and Tom spent the next hour administering the medications and supplements according to Dr. Wells' instructions. The colt accepted the treatments with surprising patience, as if he understood on some level that these interventions were helping rather than harming. When everything was done, Tom sat in the stall and simply watched Blaze rest, noting the steady rhythm of breathing, the occasional twitch of ears responding to sounds beyond the barn, the way late afternoon light caught in the white blaze that ran down the colt's face and gave him his name. That evening, as Tom prepared his own meager dinner in the cabin, he found himself thinking about Dr. Wells' parting words. Someone had made a choice to discard Blaze, had looked at a newborn life and deemed it worthless enough to abandon. Tom understood the economics of ranching, knew that hard choices sometimes had to be made, but there was a difference between euthanizing an animal humanely and leaving it to die slowly in the wilderness. Whoever had made that choice had taken the coward's path, allowing distance and exposure to do what they lacked the courage to do directly. Tom ate his dinner standing at the window, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Beyond his property line, somewhere in the direction of the mountains, lay the canyon where he had found Blaze. And beyond that, presumably, lay the ranch where the colt had been born and rejected. The distance felt both infinite and far too small. Tom had built his life on this isolated patch of ground specifically to avoid entanglements with the kind of men who ran operations large enough to throw away livestock. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. He finished eating and washed his plate, then pulled on his jacket and walked back out to the barn. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the clear sky promising frost by morning, but inside the barn, warmth accumulated from the animals and the thick walls. Tom checked on Copper first, giving the old gelding fresh hay and a pat on the neck, then moved to Blaze's stall. The colt was awake, eyes bright in the dim light from the single bulb Tom had left burning. Tom settled into his usual spot against the wall, close enough to touch Blaze but giving him space. The colt shifted slightly, moving his head so it rested near Tom's leg, a gesture that had become routine over the past weeks. Tom placed his hand on the white Blaze, feeling the warmth of living flesh beneath his palm, and made a promise that he spoke aloud into the quiet of the barn. Nobody's taking you. I don't care who comes looking. I don't care what papers they might have. You're mine now, and I'm yours, and that's the end of it. Blaze's eyes closed slowly, his breathing deepening toward sleep, and Tom sat in the darkness with his hand on the colt's face and his heart set on a path he knew might lead to conflict. But some things were worth fighting for. Some bonds, once formed, became unbreakable regardless of what the world thought or demanded. He had learned that lesson through loss, through the absence of his son, through years of isolation that had taught him the value of connection. Now, with a half-wild colt sleeping under his hand and the Montana night pressing cold against the barn walls, Tom understood that he had been given a second chance. Not to replace what he had lost, that was impossible, but to prove that he still had something to offer, that his capacity for caring hadn't died with his son. Blaze represented that chance, embodied it in every breath and heartbeat. And Tom would be damned if he let anyone or anything destroy it. Outside, the stars emerged in their thousands, cold and distant and indifferent to the small drama playing out in a weathered barn on the edge of nowhere. But inside, two lives continued their careful dance toward healing, bound together by need and choice and the stubborn refusal to accept that some things were beyond saving. The road ahead remained uncertain, threatened by complications both medical and human. But for now, in this moment, there was only warmth and presence and the quiet triumph of survival against impossible odds. The weeks turned into months, and winter settled over the high plains with the kind of permanence that made Tom wonder if spring was just a story people told to get through the dark days. Snow came and went in waves, each storm leaving behind frozen layers that built up like sediment marking time. But inside the barn, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that had nothing to do with seasons and everything to do with will. Blaze grew stronger with each passing day, his body filling out under Tom's careful feeding regimen. The ribs that had once stood out like prison bars disappeared beneath healthy flesh, and his coat began to gleam with the kind of luster that spoke of good nutrition and consistent care. His legs, which had trembled under his weight those first weeks, now carried him with increasing confidence around the stall and eventually into the small paddock Tom had cleared of snow. The first time Tom turned Blaze loose in the paddock, he held his breath as the colt took tentative steps into the open space. For a moment, Blaze simply stood there, head raised, nostrils flaring as he processed the expanse before him. Then something ignited in his body, some primal recognition of what he was meant to be, and he exploded into motion. The run was clumsy and uncoordinated, his legs still learning their purpose, but the joy in it was unmistakable. Blaze kicked out with his hind legs, tossed his head, and careened around the paddock with abandon while Tom laughed aloud, a sound that surprised him with its unfamiliarity. Beth Carson first appeared on a gray February afternoon, her truck rumbling up Tom's drive with the confidence of someone who knew these roads well. Tom had seen her in town occasionally, a woman in her early 50s who ran a small operation bordering his property to the south. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, the kind of rancher who did her own work and expected others to do the same. Tom watched from the barn as she climbed out of her truck, noting the way she moved with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste motion. "You must be Tom Brennan," she called as she approached. "Beth Carson. We're neighbors, though I suppose 20 acres between us makes that a generous term." Tom wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped out to meet her. "Mrs. Carson, what can I do for you?" She waved off the formality. "It's Beth. And I'm here because word travels in a place this empty. Heard you pulled a half-dead colt out of the Badlands and have been nursing him back. Thought I'd see for myself." Tom felt a flicker of defensiveness but pushed it down. "He's in the barn if you want a look." Beth followed him inside, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. When they reached Blaze's stall, she leaned on the rail and studied the colt with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of horses. Blaze stood near the back of the stall, watching this new visitor with cautious interest. The white blaze on his face caught the light, and Beth's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's Mustang blood," she said flatly. "See it in the stripe pattern on his legs and the way he holds himself." Tom nodded. "Figured as much." Beth was quiet. For a long moment. "You know where he came from?" Tom met her gaze. "Found him in the Badlands. Somebody left him to die." Beth's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "That would be Crown Ranch. Victor Hartwell's operation. He's been trying to breed the Mustang out of his stock for years. Considers it inferior genetics. Any foal showing those traits gets culled." The word hung in the air between them, cold and final. Tom felt his jaw tighten. Culled is a kind word for what they did. Beth nodded slowly. "Victor's a hard man, always has been. Built his reputation on champions, and he doesn't let sentiment interfere with business. But there's a difference between making tough choices and what amounts to cruelty." She paused, then added, "You should know he's been making noise in town about a stolen colt. Hasn't filed anything official yet, but he's laying groundwork." Tom's stomach dropped. He can't prove anything. Maybe not, but Victor has money and connections. If he decides to push this, it could get ugly. Beth straightened up from the rail. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Tom. Just thought you should know what you might be facing." She turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, that colt looks better cared for than half the horses I see around here. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." After she left, Tom stood in the barn for a long time, watching Blaze nose through his hay with the contentment of an animal who felt safe and fed. The threat of Victor Hartwell loomed suddenly larger, no longer an abstract possibility but a concrete danger moving toward him through channels of money and influence. Tom had no illusions about how such battles typically ended. Men like Hartwell usually got what they wanted, if not through legal means then through sheer persistence and the willingness to make life difficult enough that opposition crumbled. But as Tom looked at Blaze, at the miracle of life that had survived against impossible odds, he felt something harden in his chest. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost or the likelihood of success. He had already lost too much in his life to back down from this. Blaze represented more than just a horse. He represented the possibility that broken things could be made whole again, that care and commitment still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to both. March arrived with false promises of warmth, days where the sun felt almost kind before the temperature plummeted again after dark. Blaze continued to grow, his body filling out with muscle as Tom gradually increased his exercise. They established a routine of daily training, nothing intense but enough to build strength and coordination. Tom would lead Blaze around the property on a long line, letting him explore while maintaining control. The colt proved remarkably intelligent, learning quickly to respond to voice commands and showing a natural curiosity about everything around him. One afternoon, as they walked along the fence line with the mountains rising sharp and white in the distance, Tom noticed movement on the ridge above his property. He shaded his eyes against the glare and made out a figure on horseback, too far away to identify clearly but close enough to be obviously watching. The rider sat motionless for several minutes, then turned and disappeared back over the ridge. Tom felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He knew that land belonged to Crown Ranch, and he had no doubt the rider had been sent to observe. That night, Tom sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, trying to think through his options. He could reach out to a lawyer, but lawyers cost money he didn't have, and property disputes in Montana could drag on for years. He could try to establish official ownership through some kind of documentation, but what proof did he have beyond his own word that Blaze had been abandoned? The colt bore no brands or markings that would conclusively identify his origin, and Tom's rescue had been witnessed by no one. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled Tom from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, surprised to see it was past 9 in the evening. Headlights swept across his windows as a truck pulled into the drive, and Tom felt his muscles tense. He grabbed a jacket and stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the headlights until they cut off. The driver's door opened, and Danny Cole climbed out, his young face pale and tight with anxiety. "Mr. Brennan," Danny called, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to talk to you." Tom descended from the porch slowly, reading the distress in every line of the young man's posture. "Inside," he said shortly. They settled at the kitchen table, Tom refilling his coffee and pouring a second cup for Danny without asking. The ranch hand wrapped his hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it, though the cabin was plenty warm from the wood stove. "I'm the one who left him," Danny said abruptly, the words tumbling out like confession. "The colt in your barn. Mr. Hartwell ordered me to take him out and leave him, and I did it. I've been carrying that around for months, and then I heard in town that someone had found a colt in the Badlands. And I knew it had to be him." Tom sat back in his chair, processing this information. He had suspected Crown Ranch, but hearing Conformation brought a strange mixture of vindication and anger. "Why are you telling me this?" Danny met his eyes, and Tom saw genuine remorse there mixed with something harder, a determination that hadn't been present before. "Because Mr. Hartwell knows you have him. He sent me to ride up near your property today, told me to confirm it was the same colt. And it was. I saw the markings, the white blaze. It's him." Tom's grip tightened on his cup. "What's Hartwell planning to do?" "He's going to file a claim with the county. Say the colt was stolen property. He's got breeding records, can prove the mare was his, and that gives him legal standing to demand return." Danny leaned forward, urgency sharpening his voice. "But I can testify to what really happened. I can tell them he ordered the colt abandoned, that it was supposed to die out there. That changes things, doesn't it? Makes it abandonment instead of theft." Tom studied the young man across from him, seeing the toll that guilt had taken. Danny looked like he hadn't been sleeping well, shadows under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sustained stress. "This will cost you your job." Danny's laugh was bitter. "I already quit. Couldn't keep working for a man who'd do that and then have the gall to claim he was the victim. My conscience is worth more than that paycheck." They talked long into the night, Danny providing details about the birth and the order to dispose of the colt, the dates and circumstances that would be crucial if this went to court. By the time Danny left, well past midnight, Tom felt both better and worse. Better because he had an ally, someone willing to testify to the truth. Worse because the testimony would be needed, confirmation that this conflict was inevitable rather than merely possible. The legal papers arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a county deputy who looked uncomfortable with his task. Tom read through them slowly, his anger building with each carefully worded paragraph. Victor Hartwell was claiming ownership of one chestnut colt with distinctive markings, alleging that said colt had been removed from Crown Ranch property without authorization. The language was precise and damning, painting Tom as either a thief or someone in possession of stolen property. There was a court date scheduled for early May, giving Tom less than 6 weeks to prepare a defense. He called Dr. Wells first, explaining the situation and asking if she would be willing to testify about Blaze's condition when she first examined him. She agreed immediately, her voice sharp with anger over the phone. "That colt was hours from death when I saw him," she said. "I'll make sure the court understands exactly what condition he was in and what that means about how he came to be that way." Beth Carson was his second call, and she also agreed to help, though she warned him that going against Victor Hartwell in this county would be like swimming upstream. "The man has influence with half the judges and owns favors from most of the business owners. You're going to need to be prepared for a fight." The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation mixed with the ongoing demands of caring for Blaze. The colt seemed to sense Tom's stress, becoming more affectionate, following him around the paddock and nickering whenever Tom appeared. There were moments when Tom would stop whatever he was doing and just watch Blaze move, marveling at the transformation from the dying creature he had found in the canyon to this vital, growing animal. The Mustang blood showed not just in Blaze's markings but in his spirit, a wildness that hadn't been broken by his early trauma but rather seemed to have been refined by it into something fierce and beautiful. Tom began taking Blaze on longer walks, venturing beyond his property boundaries into the open range that stretched toward the mountains. The colt loved these expeditions, his ears constantly moving, cataloging every sound and smell. Sometimes they would encounter deer, and Blaze would freeze, watching the animals with intense focus before they bounded away. Tom noticed how quickly the colt learned the terrain, remembering landmarks and routes after a single pass. There was an intelligence in Blaze that went beyond simple training response, a capacity for understanding that made Tom think of partnership rather than ownership. One evening, as they returned from a particularly long walk, they came over a rise to find Victor Hartwell sitting on a horse at the boundary of Tom's property. The man was exactly as Tom had imagined him from Beth's descriptions, tall and commanding, with silver hair and an expression that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Blaze's entire body tensed at the sight of the stranger, and Tom felt the colt press closer to his side. "Mr. Brennan," Hartwell said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I thought we should talk before this goes any further." Tom kept his hand on Blaze's shoulder, feeling the animal's rapid heartbeat through his palm. "I've got nothing to say to you." Hartwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That colt you're so attached to came from my ranch. He's got the bloodline of my mare, and that makes him my property regardless of how you came to possess him." "You threw him away," Tom said flatly. "Left him to die in the Badlands. That makes him nobody's property but his own, and since he can't speak for himself, I'll speak for him. He's not going anywhere." Hartwell's expression hardened. "I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm willing to drop the legal action if you simply return what's mine. You're a reasonable man, Brennan. You understand how these things work." Tom took a step forward, and Blaze moved with him, a united front. "What I understand is that you looked at a newborn life and decided it wasn't worth your time. You didn't even have the decency to end it cleanly. You just threw it away like garbage and let the desert do your dirty work." "That colt had defects," Hartwell snapped, his composure slipping. "Mustang blood that would have contaminated my breeding program. I made a business decision. And I made a human one," Tom shot back. "I chose to care about something you threw away, and now you want it back because it survived despite you. Well, you can take your business decisions and your breeding program and get off my land." Hartwell stared at him for a long moment, and Tom saw the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. "This isn't over, Brennan. You'll find that fighting me is more expensive than you can afford." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving Tom standing with Blaze as the sun sank toward the western peaks. That night, Tom barely slept, his mind churning through scenarios and possibilities. He had made an enemy of a powerful man, and the consequences of that choice would ripple outward in ways he couldn't fully predict. But as dawn broke and he walked out to the barn to find Blaze waiting for him, eager and trusting, Tom knew with absolute certainty that he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The court date arrived with the kind of clear spring weather that seemed to mock the darkness of the proceedings. Tom wore his best shirt and cleanest jeans, feeling out of place as he walked into the county courthouse with its wood-paneled walls and stern portraits of judges past. Danny met him outside, looking nervous but determined, and together they entered the courtroom where Victor Hartwell sat with his lawyer, both men projecting confidence and entitlement. The hearing lasted 4 hours, a parade of testimony and evidence that painted two completely different pictures of the same events. Hartwell's lawyer presented breeding records and ownership documents, establishing without question that Blaze's mother belonged to Crown Ranch. He spoke eloquently about property rights and the importance of protecting ranchers' investments. When Danny took the stand and described the order to abandon the colt, Hartwell's lawyer tore into him, suggesting he was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Dr. Wells testified about Blaze's condition when she first examined him, describing in clinical detail the near-death state of an animal that had been exposed to elements and deprived of food and care. She made clear that, in her professional opinion, the colt had been abandoned deliberately and would have died without immediate intervention. Beth Carson spoke about community standards and the difference between culling and abandonment, her testimony carrying weight because of her reputation for straight dealing. Finally, Tom took the stand himself, his hands shaking slightly as he described finding Blaze in the canyon, the decision to bring him home, the weeks of intensive care. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. When Hartwell's lawyer tried to suggest Tom had stolen the colt, Tom met his eyes directly. "I saved a dying animal that someone had thrown away like trash. If that's theft in your eyes, then I guess I'm guilty. But I sleep just fine at night." The judge, an older woman with iron-gray hair and an expression that suggested she had heard every lie and excuse humans could manufacture, listened to everything without visible reaction. When the testimony concluded, she called a recess to consider her ruling. Tom sat on a bench outside the courtroom, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, while Danny paced and Beth sat with the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting for verdicts. 2 hours later, they were called back in. The judge looked at each party in turn, her gaze lingering longest on Victor Hartwell before she began to speak. "This case represents a conflict between property law and basic standards of animal welfare. Mr. Hartwell, your ownership of the mare is not in dispute, and under normal circumstances that would extend to her offspring. However, the testimony presented here, particularly that of Mr. Cole and Dr. Wells, establishes that you ordered this foal abandoned in a manner designed to result in its death. In Montana, deliberate abandonment of livestock constitutes forfeiture of ownership rights." Hartwell's face darkened, but the judge continued, her voice firm. "Mr. Brennan's rescue and care of this animal represents a good-faith effort to save a life that you had discarded. While I cannot condone taking property that belongs to another, I also cannot ignore the circumstances that led to that taking. Therefore, I'm ruling that ownership of the colt in question is hereby transferred to Tom Brennan, with the condition that Mr. Hartwell be reimbursed for documented expenses related to the mare's pregnancy and birth." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Tom sat frozen, unable to process that he had won, that Blaze was truly his now in the eyes of the law. Danny let out a whoop that earned him a sharp look from the bailiff, and Beth actually smiled, a rare expression that transformed her weathered face. Hartwell stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't over," he said, his voice tight with rage. "I'll appeal." The judge looked at him coolly. "That is your right, Mr. Hartwell. But I would caution you to consider whether pursuing this matter further serves any purpose other than pride. The colt is thriving under Mr. Brennan's care, and the court's view of deliberate animal abandonment is unlikely to change on appeal." They left the courthouse into brilliant afternoon sunshine that felt like a benediction. Tom found himself shaking hands with people he barely knew, other ranchers and townspeople who had come to watch the proceedings. The consensus seemed to be that Victor Hartwell had gotten what he deserved, and Tom Brennan had proven himself worthy of respect. Danny was grinning so wide his face looked like it might split, and even Beth allowed herself a moment of celebration before reminding Tom that Hartwell was unlikely to accept defeat gracefully. But none of that mattered as Tom drove home, his hands steady on the wheel for the first time in weeks. Blaze was waiting when he arrived, the colt's head visible over the paddock fence, and Tom felt something break loose in his chest when those dark eyes found him. He climbed out of the truck and walked to the fence, and Blaze stretched his neck over the top rail to press his muzzle against Tom's chest in a gesture that had become their ritual. "You're mine now," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion, "official and legal. Nobody can take you away." Blaze exhaled softly, warm breath against Tom's shirt, and for a moment they stood that way, man and horse, bound together by something deeper than ownership or law. They had both been broken in different ways, both carried scars that would never fully heal, but together they had found something neither could have achieved alone. As spring deepened into summer and the high plains burst into brief bloom, Tom and Blaze continued their daily routine, but now without the shadow of legal threat hanging over them. Tom began teaching Blaze to accept a saddle, working slowly and patiently through the process. The colt proved remarkably willing, that Mustang intelligence making him curious rather than fearful. By July, Tom was riding him around the property, feeling the power in Blaze's stride and the responsive connection between them. Word of Blaze spread through the community. The story of the throwaway colt who had survived and thrived, becoming something people repeated with a note of pride, as if his success reflected well on all of them. Beth Carson stopped by regularly, offering advice on training and occasionally bringing feed supplements she claimed were extra from her own operation. Dr. Wells checked on Blaze monthly, documenting his progress with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a medical miracle. Danny Cole found work with Beth, and the two would sometimes visit together, Danny grinning as he watched Blaze race around the paddock with the kind of joy that suggested he had found his own form of redemption. He told Tom once, late on a summer evening as they watched the sun set over the mountains, that saving Blaze had saved him too, had shown him that standing up for what was right mattered even when it cost him something. Victor Hartwell never did file that appeal, though Tom heard through the rumor mill that the man had sold Crown Ranch and moved to Wyoming. Whether the loss in court had been the final straw or simply one embarrassment too many, Tom didn't know and didn't particularly care. What mattered was that Blaze was safe, thriving, growing into the horse he was meant to be. On a clear September morning, exactly 1 year after Tom had found Blaze in the canyon, he saddled the horse and rode out to that place. They stood together on the ridge above the rocks where Blaze had nearly died, and Tom felt the full weight of everything that had happened wash over him. A year ago he had been alone, isolated by grief and the belief that he had nothing left to offer the world. Now he stood with a horse who trusted him completely, surrounded by a community that had rallied to help, and filled with a purpose he had thought lost forever. Blaze shifted beneath him, eager to move, and Tom gave him his head. They flew across the Badlands, the horse's stride eating up ground with effortless power, and Tom felt something close to joy singing through his veins. This was what Blaze had been meant for, not championship ribbons or breeding records, but this pure expression of life and strength and the refusal to give up. They had both been discarded by people who measured worth in narrow terms, but together they had proven that value came from somewhere deeper, from the choice to care and the courage to fight for what mattered. As they circled back toward home, Tom saw the small cabin and barn that represented his world, and he felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. Blaze had given him purpose, but more than that, the horse had given him back himself, the part of him that believed broken things could heal and that redemption was always possible for those willing to reach for it. They slowed to a walk as they approached the property, and Tom leaned forward to pat Blaze's neck. The horse turned his head slightly, one eye rolling back to look at him, and in that gaze Tom saw recognition and trust and something that might have been gratitude. He straightened in the saddle, squared his shoulders, and rode home with his head held high, knowing that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together. The Mustang blood that had condemned Blaze in Victor Hartwell's eyes had become the source of his greatest strength, that wild resilience combined with intelligence and heart creating something remarkable. And Tom, the broken cowboy who had lived too long with ghosts, had found in this castaway horse a reason to believe in miracles again. Not the flashy kind that made headlines, but the quiet, everyday miracle of two damaged souls choosing to save each other. As the sun climbed higher and warmed the autumn air, Tom dismounted and turned Blaze loose in the paddock. The horse immediately rolled in the dirt, legs kicking skyward, then surged to his feet and shook himself vigorously, sending up clouds of dust that caught the light like gold. Tom laughed, really laughed, the sound carrying across his small piece of Montana and mixing with the wind that swept down from the mountains. This was where they both belonged, on this hard land that demanded everything and gave back just enough, together in the kind of partnership that defied explanation but needed none. Blaze had been nobody's horse, thrown away and left for dead, until a cowboy with nothing left to lose decided that every life deserved a chance. And in that decision, both man and horse had found not just survival but something better, a purpose born from the simple radical act of refusing to look away from suffering. The story could have ended a dozen different ways, most of them tragic, but instead it had led here, to this moment of peace and possibility. Tom Brennan had given Blaze a second chance at life, but the truth that he was only now beginning to fully understand was that Blaze had done the same for him. They had saved each other, and that was the only miracle that mattered. The Montana summer had been generous that year, bringing rain when it was needed and sun in careful measure, so that by August the high plains wore a coat of green that would soon fade to gold. Tom had watched the seasons turn from his porch countless times over the years, but this summer felt different, charged with a possibility he hadn't dared name until now. Blaze had grown into himself over the months since the court ruling, filling out with muscle that rippled beneath his chestnut coat, his movements gaining confidence and power that spoke to the Mustang blood flowing through his veins. Beth Carson had been the one to plant the seed, arriving one afternoon with a flyer clutched in her weathered hand. The Ridgefield County Rodeo was holding a series of open competitions in September, nothing fancy but legitimate events that drew ranchers and horsemen from across the region. There was a barrel racing event, some roping competitions, and a time trail course that tested both horse and rider across varied terrain. Beth had tossed the flyer onto Tom's kitchen table and crossed her arms, waiting. "You should enter him," she said without preamble. "That colt has speed and he's smart as they come. People need to see what he's become." Tom picked up the flyer, studying it while his mind raced through a dozen objections. "He's barely 2 years old. Still green. We've only been riding seriously for a few months." Beth snorted. "I've seen you two out there. That horse moves like he was born knowing what to do, and you ride him like you've been partners for decades. Besides, it's not about winning. It's about showing up. Showing everyone, including Hartwell if he's still paying attention, that the throwaway colt isn't just surviving. He's excelling." The idea took root despite Tom's reservations, growing in the quiet hours when he worked with Blaze or watched the horse explore the boundaries of the property with endless curiosity. There was something in Blaze that wanted to run, wanted to test himself against challenges, and Tom recognized it because he had felt the same pull in his younger years before life had beaten it out of him. Maybe Beth was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding on his 20 acres and show the world what redemption looked like. He started training Blaze more deliberately after that, setting up obstacles in the paddock and timing their runs across measured distances. The colt took to it with an enthusiasm that bordered on joy, attacking each new challenge with the kind of focus that made Tom's chest tight with pride. They worked on turns and stops, on responding to subtle shifts in weight and pressure, building a language between them that transcended words. Blaze learned to read Tom's intentions almost before Tom fully formed them, that Mustang intelligence translating into an intuitive partnership that felt less like training and more like conversation. Danny stopped by regularly to help, his natural affinity for horses proving invaluable as they refined Blaze's skills. The young man had found his footing working for Beth, and the guilt that had haunted him seemed to have transformed into something more productive, a determination to prove that people could change, could make amends for their mistakes. He would stand at the fence and watch Blaze run, and sometimes Tom would catch an expression on Danny's face that suggested he was seeing his own redemption reflected in the horse's transformation. Dr. Wells came by in late August to give Blaze a thorough examination before the competition, checking everything from his hooves to his heart rate recovery after exercise. She spent over an hour going through her assessment, then sat on Tom's porch with a cup of coffee and delivered her verdict. "He's in better condition than 90% of the horses I see. Whatever you're doing, it's working." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You know there will be people at that rodeo who remember the court case. Some will be cheering for you. Others will be hoping to see you fail." Tom nodded slowly. "I know, but this isn't about them. It's about Blaze getting a chance to show what he can do." Dr. Wells smiled, the expression softening her typically stern features. "Then you're entering for the right reasons. Just remember he's still young. Don't push too hard if he seems overwhelmed." Tom promised, though part of him wondered if Blaze even knew how to be overwhelmed. The colt approached everything with a fearlessness that seemed to come from having already faced death and found it wanting. The week before the rodeo, Tom focused on keeping their routine steady, avoiding any changes that might stress Blaze or alter the rhythm they had established. They rode out each morning into the Badlands, following trails that wound between rock formations and across open stretches where Blaze could open up and run. Tom would give him his head during those moments, feeling the incredible power gathering and releasing beneath him, the smooth cadence of hooves eating up ground. The Mustang blood that had condemned Blaze in Victor Hartwell's eyes now revealed itself as pure advantage, giving the horse stamina and sure-footedness that domestic breeding sometimes sacrificed for size or appearance. On one of those morning rides, they encountered a small herd of wild mustangs grazing in a valley, the first Tom had seen in that area for years. Blaze froze when he spotted them, every muscle tensing as he watched his wild cousins move across the landscape. The stallion leading the herd lifted his head, testing the air, and for a long moment the two horses stared at each other across the distance. Tom felt Blaze quiver beneath him, some deep recognition passing between domestic and wild, and he wondered what the colt was thinking, whether some part of him longed for that freedom or whether he understood that his path had diverged permanently from theirs. Then the moment broke, the wild stallion wheeling away and taking his herd with him in a thunder of hooves, and Blaze turned back toward home as if satisfied with what he had seen. Tom rode in silence, thinking about the choices that define lives, how Blaze had been born into domesticity but carried wilderness in his blood, how Tom himself had spent years trying to escape his past only to find that running solved nothing. They were both creatures caught between worlds, and maybe that was what made their partnership work. They understood each other's contradictions. The morning of the rodeo dawned clear and cool, autumn's first breath evident in the air. Tom loaded Blaze into the borrowed trailer with hands that shook slightly despite his best efforts at calm. The horse stepped in without hesitation, trusting Tom's judgment completely, and that trust felt like both a gift and a tremendous responsibility. They made the drive to Ridgefield in comfortable silence, Tom's mind running through everything they had practiced while simultaneously trying not to overthink what lay ahead. The rodeo grounds were already buzzing with activity when they arrived, trucks and trailers filling the parking area, while competitors exercised their horses in designated warm-up spaces. Tom found a spot to park and took his time unloading Blaze, letting the colt adjust to the noise and crowd. Several people stopped to look as Tom led Blaze toward the registration area, and he heard the whispers following them, the recognition rippling through the gathering. That's Tom Brennan, the guy who fought Hartwell in court. That's the colt that was supposed to die. Look at him now. Tom kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on Blaze's lead, refusing to acknowledge the attention. Blaze, for his part, seemed curious rather than nervous, his ears swiveling constantly as he catalogued the new environment. They registered for the time trial competition, a challenging course that wound through natural terrain and tested a horse's agility, speed, and willingness to tackle obstacles. Beth found them as they were warming up, her face betraying none of her usual skepticism. You two look good. Remember, the course has a water crossing about halfway through. Some horses balk at it, but I'm betting Blaze won't. She was right. When Tom walked the course before his run, he noted the creek crossing with its rocky bottom and swift current, but he trusted Blaze's sure-footedness. They had crossed similar terrain on their training rides, and the horse had never hesitated at water. Danny appeared as Tom was saddling up for their run, his young face tight with excitement. Half the county's here to watch. There's even some folks who drove up from Crown Ranch territory, though I didn't see Hartwell himself. Tom cinched the saddle and checked it twice. Good. This isn't about him anyway. He swung up into the saddle, feeling Blaze gather beneath him, ready and eager. Danny stepped back, raising his hand in a gesture that was half wave, half salute, and Tom guided Blaze toward the starting line. They were scheduled near the middle of the competition, giving Tom a chance to watch several other riders tackle the course. The times were competitive, most falling between 8 and 10 minutes for the mile-long route with its various challenges. Some horses struggled with the water crossing or balked at the steep incline in the final stretch. One rider was thrown when his horse refused to jump over a fallen log, and Tom felt his stomach clench at the reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Then the announcer called his name, and suddenly they were at the starting gate with nothing between them and the course but Tom's nerve and Blaze's ability. Tom leaned forward, speaking softly to the horse. All right, buddy, let's show them what you're made of. The starting buzzer sounded, sharp and clear, and Blaze exploded forward. The first section was a straightaway that allowed for speed, and Blaze stretched into a gallop that felt effortless and powerful. Tom kept his weight centered and his hands light, letting the horse find his rhythm while providing just enough guidance to keep them on track. They hit the first turn at full speed, Blaze's body coiling and releasing perfectly as he navigated the corner without losing momentum. The crowd's noise faded into background static, Tom's entire world narrowing to the feel of the horse beneath him and the terrain ahead. The obstacle section came next, a series of tight turns around barrels followed by the log jump that had unseated an earlier rider. Blaze wove through the barrels with the precision of a much more experienced horse, his Mustang agility allowing him to pivot on his haunches and change direction in spaces that seemed impossibly small. When they approached the log, Tom felt Blaze's stride adjust automatically, gathering for the jump, and then they were airborne for a heartbeat before landing clean on the other side and accelerating again. The water crossing appeared ahead, sunlight glinting off the surface of the creek. Tom felt Blaze's attention sharpen, assessing the obstacle, but the horse never broke stride. They hit the water at speed, spray flying up around them, and Blaze powered through with his head down and his legs pumping, finding purchase on the rocky bottom and emerging on the far side without hesitation. Tom heard himself, laughing, pure exhilaration breaking through his concentration. The final stretch was the killer, a steep upward slope that tested both horse and rider's endurance. Tom shifted his weight forward, giving Blaze every advantage, and felt the horse dig deep. This was where months of careful feeding and gradual conditioning paid off, where the body that had been starved and broken proved its complete resurrection. Blaze attacked the hill with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond physical training, that same stubbornness that had kept him alive in the canyon now driving him toward the finish line. They crested the top and saw the flags marking the end of the course, and Tom gave Blaze the tiniest squeeze with his legs, permission to give everything in this final sprint. The horse responded instantly, finding reserves Tom hadn't known existed, and they crossed the finish line in a thunder of hooves and heaving breath. Tom pulled Blaze back to a trot, then a walk, letting the horse cool down gradually while his own heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at the timing board and felt his breath catch. 7 minutes, 42 seconds. The fastest time of the day by nearly 30 seconds. The crowd's reaction was delayed, as if everyone needed a moment to process what they had just witnessed. But then the applause started, building from scattered clapping into something that sounded like thunder. Tom dismounted and immediately went to check Blaze, running his hands over the horse's legs and checking his breathing. The colt was breathing hard but recovering quickly, his eyes bright and his manner suggesting he had thoroughly enjoyed himself. Tom pressed his forehead against Blaze's neck, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride and relief and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. Beth reached them first, her normally composed face split by a grin. That was the finest riding I've seen in 20 years. That horse is special, Tom. Really special. Danny arrived moments later, practically bouncing with excitement, followed by Dr. Wells who wanted to check Blaze over before the official results were announced. More people crowded around, ranchers Tom barely knew offering congratulations and asking questions about Blaze's training. Tom answered automatically, his attention mostly focused on the horse, making sure the crowd's attention wasn't stressing him. The official announcement came an hour later, confirming what everyone already knew. Tom Brennan and Blaze had won the time trail competition by a margin that would be talked about for years. The prize was modest, a ribbon and a small cash purse, but Tom clutched both as if they were made of gold. When he led Blaze into the winner's circle for the traditional photograph, he saw faces in the crowd he recognized from the courthouse, people who had witnessed the legal battle and now bore witness to its vindication. But more important than any of that was the moment after the ceremony, when Tom led Blaze away from the crowds to a quiet spot where they could both decompress. He removed the saddle and brushed the horse down slowly, taking his time with the familiar ritual. Blaze stood patiently, occasionally turning his head to nose at Tom's shoulder, and in those moments Tom felt the full weight of what they had accomplished together. This victory wasn't really about a rodeo competition or proving anything to Victor Hartwell or anyone else. It was about the journey from that canyon to this moment, about two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. The drive home happened in a golden sunset that painted the high plains in shades of amber and rose. Tom glanced in his rearview mirror repeatedly to check on Blaze in the trailer, and each time he saw the horse standing calmly, head low, content. When they finally pulled into the drive at Tom's property, Copper greeted them with a loud whinny from the paddock, and Tom felt something settle in his chest, a sense of homecoming that went deeper than geography. He unloaded Blaze and gave him a thorough grooming before turning him out into the paddock with fresh hay and water. The horse rolled immediately, covering himself in dust that undid all of Tom's careful cleaning, and Tom laughed at the sight. He stood at the fence as dusk deepened into night, watching Blaze and Copper graze side by side, and felt a peace he hadn't known since before his son's death. The grief would always be there, that hole nothing could fill, but it had shifted somehow, no longer consuming everything but existing alongside joy and purpose and the daily miracle of caring for something that needed him. The weeks following the rodeo brought changes Tom hadn't anticipated. Other ranchers reached out, asking if he would consider training their horses or offering advice on problem animals. The attention made him uncomfortable at first, but Beth convinced him to take on a few projects, pointing out that his small operation could use the income and that he had a gift worth sharing. Tom started working with a handful of horses, bringing them to his property for intensive training sessions, and discovered that he enjoyed the challenge of understanding each animal's unique personality and needs. Danny became an unofficial apprentice, spending his free time at Tom's place and soaking up knowledge with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his calling. They worked together with the training horses, Tom explaining his methods while Danny took notes and asked endless questions. The young man had a natural empathy for animals that reminded Tom of his younger self, and he found satisfaction in passing along skills he had accumulated over decades. But the core of Tom's world remained Blaze. Every morning began with the colt, and every evening ended the same way. They continued their rides into the Badlands, no longer training for competition but simply enjoying the partnership they had built. Sometimes Beth would join them, and occasionally Danny, and these rides became a kind of therapy for all of them, a chance to escape the demands of daily life and simply exist in the vast Montana landscape. One autumn afternoon, as they rode through a valley where aspen leaves turned the hillsides to gold, Beth brought up something Tom had been avoiding thinking about. You know, people are going to want to see Blaze compete again. There's talk of bigger rodeos, maybe even some of the regional championships. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching Blaze's ears flick back and forth as the horse navigated the trail. I don't know if I want that. We've got a good thing here. I don't want to risk it by pushing too hard. Beth nodded slowly. I understand that, but consider this. Every time Blaze shows up and proves what he can do, it challenges people's assumptions. It makes them think twice before throwing away an animal they judge as worthless. That colt is living proof that value isn't always obvious at first glance, and that's a message worth spreading. Her words stayed with Tom through the following weeks, echoing in his mind during the quiet moments when he worked around the property or sat on his porch watching the stars emerge. He thought about all the animals he had seen discarded over the years, judged too weak or too wild or simply inconvenient, and he wondered how many of them might have thrived given a chance. Blaze hadn't been special because of breeding or conformation or any of the things that ranchers typically valued. He had been special because of spirit, because of the ineffable quality that made him fight for life even when death would have been easier. In late October, Tom made his decision. He entered Blaze in the Montana State Championship Rodeo, scheduled for the following June. It would give them time to train properly without rushing, time to build on what they had already established. When he told Beth and Danny, both of them broke into wide grins. Danny immediately started making plans for additional training elements they could incorporate, while Beth promised to help with the logistics of traveling to the state capital where the championship would be held. The winter that followed was harsh even by Montana standards, with storms that buried the high plains under snow and temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. Tom spent long hours in the barn, keeping the horses comfortable and safe, and used the forced downtime to deepen his bond with Blaze. They worked on ground exercises when riding was impossible, refining their communication until Tom could direct the horse with the slightest gesture or shift in posture. Blaze seemed to understand that they were working toward something, bringing a focus to their sessions that impressed even Beth when she braved the weather to check on them. Spring arrived late that year, the snow lingering stubbornly into April before finally releasing its grip on the land. But when it came, the transformation was spectacular. the high plains exploding into bloom with a profusion of wildflowers that painted the valleys in purple and gold. Tom increased their training intensity as the ground dried out, building Blaze's stamina and refining the skills they would need for the championship. The horse was 3 years old now, fully mature and in his absolute prime, and watching him run was like watching poetry written in muscle and motion. Danny had moved into Tom's spare room by then, officially apprenticing and helping with the expanded training operation that now kept them both busy. The cabin that had been so silent for so long now rang with conversation and laughter, and Tom found himself grateful for the company, for the reminder that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitability. They talked over meals about training techniques and problem horses, but also about larger things, about the nature of redemption and second chances, about how people and animals weren't so different when it came to needing purpose and connection. As June approached, the entire community seemed to rally around them. Beth organized a fundraiser to help cover travel expenses, and to Tom's embarrassment, it was oversubscribed within days. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment, and the feed store owner presented Tom with enough high-quality grain to last through the summer. Dr. Wells conducted a final health check on Blaze and declared him in the best condition she had ever seen, then refused payment for her services. The outpouring of support left Tom speechless and humbled, forcing him to accept that his story with Blaze had touched something in people, had become a symbol of something larger than just one man and one horse. The drive to the state capitol took most of a day, Tom and Danny taking turns at the wheel while Blaze rode calmly in the trailer behind them. They had arranged to stay at a small ranch on the outskirts of the city, owned by a friend of Beth's who welcomed them warmly and gave Blaze a spacious stall in a clean barn. The championship rodeo was a 3-day event with competitions in multiple disciplines, but Tom had entered only the advanced trail course, feeling it played to Blaze's strengths better than pure speed events where horses bred specifically for racing might have an advantage. The night before their competition, Tom lay awake in the unfamiliar bed and thought about the journey that had brought them here. 2 years ago, he had been a man with nothing to live for, going through the motions of existence without purpose or joy. Then fate had placed a dying colt in his path, and everything had changed. He had given Blaze life, but the horse had returned the favor tenfold, filling the emptiness with meaning and connection, and the daily reminder that caring for something beyond yourself was what made life worth living. The morning of the competition dawned bright and hot, summer arriving with force. Tom worked with Blaze for over an hour, warming him up slowly and checking every detail of their equipment. Danny fussed over them both, making sure everything was perfect, while Beth had driven up overnight to be there for the competition. When Tom mounted up and rode toward the staging area, he saw her standing at the fence with her arms crossed, that familiar stern expression on her face. But when their eyes met, she nodded once, sharp and definite, and that was all the encouragement Tom needed. The championship course was significantly more challenging than anything Blaze had tackled before, winding through 2 miles of varied terrain with obstacles that would test every aspect of their partnership. Tom walked it twice, memorizing every turn and challenge, noting where they could make up time and where they needed to prioritize safety over speed. The field of competitors was the strongest Tom had ever faced, riders who had been training their entire lives with horses bred for excellence, and he felt the weight of being the outsider, the man who had walked in with a throwaway colt and dared to dream. But when their turn came and Blaze stood at the starting line, Tom felt all his nerves fall away. They had trained for this, prepared as thoroughly as possible, but more important than any of that was the trust between them. He leaned forward and spoke softly into Blaze's ear, words only the horse would hear, and felt the animal's entire body tense with anticipation. The buzzer sounded and they were off, launching into the course with explosive acceleration. The first section was a technical series of tight turns through standing poles, requiring precision and balance, and Blaze navigated it like he had been born for this moment. Tom sat deep in the saddle and gave the horse freedom to find his path, trusting those Mustang instincts to guide them through. They flowed from one challenge to the next, jumping obstacles and fording streams, climbing steep grades and thundering down the other side, all of it blurring into a single continuous expression of partnership and trust. Halfway through the course, Tom became aware that they were ahead of pace, moving faster than he had thought possible while still maintaining control. Blaze seemed to have found another level entirely, tapping into reserves of speed and agility that transcended training. The horse was running not just with his body but with his spirit, channeling everything he had survived, everything he had overcome, into this single perfect performance. The final obstacle was a water crossing followed immediately by a steep uphill sprint to the finish, designed to test both courage and stamina in rapid succession. Tom felt Blaze gather himself as they approached the water, and then they were splashing through it, water flying up in sheets, and hitting the far bank without breaking stride. The hill loomed ahead, brutal and unforgiving, but Blaze attacked it with ferocious determination, his legs pumping and his breath coming in rhythmic gasps that Tom matched with his own. They crested the top and saw the finish line, and Tom felt tears blur his vision as he realized they were going to make it, that this impossible journey was about to reach its culmination. Blaze found one last burst of speed, carrying them across the line in a time that Tom couldn't even process, and then it was over. They had done it. They had competed at the highest level and not just survived but excelled. Tom dismounted on shaking legs and immediately went to Blaze, checking him over with trembling hands. The horse was breathing hard but already recovering, his eyes bright and his manner suggesting tremendous satisfaction with what they had accomplished. Danny reached them first, followed by Beth, and then Dr. Wells, who had apparently driven up without telling anyone, and they clustered around in a tight knot of celebration and relief. The official results took an hour to compile, but when they were finally posted, Tom stood staring at them in disbelief. Blaze had won, not just one but set a new course record, completing the challenging trail faster than any horse in the championship's 15-year history. The margin of victory was substantial, leaving no room for debate or qualification. They had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that the throwaway colt was something extraordinary. The awards ceremony felt surreal, Tom accepting the champion's trophy, while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. He answered mechanically, saying something about hard work and belief, but his attention was really on Blaze, standing calmly beside him as if he had always known this moment would come. When they asked for the secret of their success, Tom paused and then spoke from his heart. This horse was left to die because someone looked at him and saw only flaws. They couldn't see past the Mustang blood, the weak body, the ways he didn't fit their idea of perfection. But I looked at him and saw a life worth saving, and he repaid that faith 1,000 times over. The secret isn't training or technique. It's believing that every life has value, even when that value isn't immediately obvious. Blaze didn't become a champion despite his rough start. He became a champion because of it. Everything he survived made him stronger, and that strength was always there, waiting for someone to give him a chance to show it. The words resonated, spreading through the crowd and eventually making their way into newspaper articles and online forums. Blaze's story became something larger than just a competition victory, transforming into a parable about second chances and the danger of judging too quickly. Tom received letters from across the country, from people who had been inspired to rescue animals or change their own lives after hearing what he and Blaze had accomplished together. But all of that faded into background noise when Tom loaded Blaze into the trailer for the long drive home. Just the three of them, Tom and Danny and the horse who had changed everything. They drove through the Montana night with the trophy rattling in the cab and Blaze standing calm in the trailer behind them, and Tom felt a completeness he had never expected to experience again. When they finally pulled into the drive at Tom's property as dawn was breaking, Copper greeted them with his usual whinny, impatient for breakfast and unimpressed by championship trophies. Tom unloaded Blaze and turned him out into the paddock, and watched as the two horses touched noses in greeting before moving off to graze together. The trophy sat on Tom's kitchen table, gleaming in the morning light, but it was just metal and ribbon, no more important really than any other day they had spent together. Danny made coffee while Tom stood at the window, looking out at his 20 acres of stubborn Montana earth and the two horses grazing peacefully in the golden dawn. He thought about Victor Hartwell, wherever he was now, and hoped the man had learned something from losing what he threw away. He thought about all the people who had helped them reach this point, Beth and Dr. Wells and even Danny, who had found his own redemption in telling the truth. But mostly he thought about Blaze, about the miracle of survival and transformation, about how sometimes the greatest gifts come in packages we almost overlook. The colt that nobody wanted had become a champion, but more than that, he had become the catalyst for healing in a broken man and a testament to the power of refusing to give up. Tom had saved Blaze's life in that canyon 2 years ago, but the truth he understood fully now was that Blaze had saved him right back. They had rescued each other from different kinds of death, and in doing so had proven that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. As the sun climbed higher and warmed the autumn air, Tom walked out to the paddock and called to Blaze. The horse lifted his head from grazing and trotted over immediately, pressing his muzzle into Tom's chest in their familiar greeting. Tom wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and stood that way for a long moment, feeling the solid warmth of living muscle and the steady rhythm of breathing, and knew with absolute certainty that this was enough. The championship and the recognition were fine, but they weren't what mattered. What mattered was this connection, this bond forged in adversity and tempered by trust, this daily choice to show up for each other regardless of what the world thought or demanded. They had both been discarded, deemed unworthy by systems that measured value in narrow terms, but together they had redefined what worth meant. It wasn't about perfection or meeting someone else's standards. It was about heart and resilience and the stubborn refusal to accept that some lives mattered less than others. Blaze had taught Tom that lesson through his very existence, and Tom had honored it by never giving up, even when logic said the fight was lost. The future stretched ahead of them now, full of possibility and unmarked by the shadows of the past. There would be more training horses to work with, more people who needed to hear their story, more mornings watching the sun rise over the high plains. But whatever came, they would face it together, the cowboy and the castaway, bound by something deeper than ownership or circumstance. They had found in each other what both had lost, and that discovery had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.